of the global phenomenon that is the anti-apartheid struggle that engaged governments, corporates, banking, political personalities, universities, artists, social activists, and just ordinary citizens from around the world. Perhaps the major part of this American story is the relationships that developed between indigenous South Africans and African Americans even before the establishment of the apartheid regime. And the bonds of solidarity and collaboration that grew as each dealt with this parallel and respective forms of racial discrimination, the political, educational, religious, and cultural exchanges that developed and bound them together in the struggle against injustice in America and in Africa, particularly in South Africa, and the inspiration and concrete material support that the American political action brought to the indigenous South African struggles for freedom, democracy, and justice for more than 100 years. Finally, if this America's Voices Against Apartheid initiative does nothing else, we hope to highlight the real live human beings, the American people, the leaders, the major political institutions and activist organizations, and the not so ordinary grassroots activists who dared to question and challenge America's, that is, the official American government's misguided and anti-democratic foreign, political, and economic policy vis-a-vis South African apartheid in the name of the American people. But the people said no to the American government's official representations and took it to the streets, to the banks, to the boardrooms, the trustees, the corporate headquarters, to the South African embassy and its consulates, and to the United States government itself, and said no to apartheid, no to oppression, no to murdering and jailing South African freedom fighters, no to the South African military and police state, and challenged the multiracial South Africa to create a new democratic South Africa. We decided to hold our project launch on this date and from this space intentionally. First, today is the 15th of January, the birthday of the iconic civil rights leader, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. We honor Dr. King, who, as you know, was a leader of the U.S. civil rights movement, and which, as I mentioned earlier, intersected with the anti-apartheid movement. His declaration that a threat to justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere essentially embodies the ties that bind Americans and South Africans. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bailey. Certainly a very impressive and massive project, but we look forward to learning a bit more about the lessons that we can extract from the global anti-apartheid movement and how it continues to inform current struggles as well. Certainly a project of this nature would not be possible without some key and strategic partnerships. We're very grateful for the partnership of the US administration. And from the South African perspective, now we're joined by the United States Ambassador to South Africa, and that's Ambassador Lana Marks. Ambassador?
Dumelang, Sanibonani, Molweni, Goeienaand. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Today, we are gathered to virtually launch the America's Voices Against Apartheid project, and I'm thrilled to have joined this project from the outset in 2019. I want to thank all of the leaders and project participants gathered across South Africa and the United States, including the South African Embassy in Washington, D.C., for their support of this important work. Ambassador Mafeketo, I share this moment with you with immense gratitude. This is the kind of project that we seek as ambassadors because it safeguards and builds upon the historical support between our two countries, our shared challenges, and the progress we have made in ensuring that the friendship between our two countries remains strong. Indeed, these are the ties that bind us. I have been impressed by the work of Dr. Bailey's team with our partners, the National African American Drug Policy Coalition, and respected historians from Howard University and academic institutions across the United States. The America's Voices Against Apartheid project will be a well-researched labor of love and a celebration of good's ability to transcend hardship. I am reminded of the young American Fulbright student, Amy Beale, whose labor of love led her to Gugulethu in Cape Town, where she was caught in the crossfire and lost her life in 1993. Her parents later established the Amy Beale Foundation, which offers development programs for challenged youth and vulnerable communities. This work in her name lays a firm foundation for future academic progress and provides hope for change. Her name is inscribed at Freedom Park in Pretoria in recognition of her contributions, an American woman who gave her life in hope of making South Africa better. South Africans are likewise committed to making the United States better, as we saw this past year when they used their voices to condemn police brutality in the United States. Our countries share painful histories and lessons learned at great cost to our people. But we also share sacred principles that people are equal before the law and all human beings deserve freedom, respect, and preservation of their dignity. Governments need to safeguard these rights, and citizens need to remain active agents of change and hold governments to account. It is these ties that bind us, that drive the America's Voices Against Apartheid project, and I am honored to add my voice to those urging this important work forward. There is so much to be done. Thank you.
We're also delighted to be joined today by the US Consul General to South Africa, that's Heather Merritt. We look forward to your comments, ma'am. Over to you.
Good evening to those joining us from South Africa, and good morning to those joining us from the United States. My name is Heather Merritt, and I'm the United States Consul General in Johannesburg. The U.S. mission in South Africa conceived and funded the America's Voices Against Apartheid project to honor and record the efforts of those in the United States who felt a moral obligation to join the struggle against apartheid. In so doing, we honor those who have gone before us, as well as those at the forefront of today's social justice movements. both here in South Africa and in the United States of America. I want to personally thank our implementing partner, the National African American Drug Policy Coalition, and Dr. Jean Bailey of Howard University, who is tirelessly leading this effort to document the close and long-standing partnership between the peoples of South Africa and the United States. I also want to acknowledge the advisory committee of the America's Voices Against Apartheid project, which includes both South African and American citizens. We have the good fortune to be in the company of some of the most spirited and resilient leaders who made significant sacrifices for the greater good of humanity. These people and their bold, selfless actions are what this project aims to immortalize. The many friends of South Africa in the United States have demonstrated how our global community can support one another. This project will record their contributions. Contributions which existed in student and community halls, in recording studios, on factory floors and decorated podiums, in backyard gatherings and around kitchen tables. We have seen the same convictions and principles in the United States and South Africa. We have learned from both the U.S. civil rights movement and the struggle for freedom in South Africa that voices guiding our moral compasses are more powerful than any weapons. In 1956, courageous women descended on the Union buildings to demand justice. And in 2019, their descendants did the same at the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. 2020 brought massive protests in the United States in the name of justice and the protection of human dignity. The lesson is that we must not remain silent in the face of oppressive, entrenched injustice. These recent events are troubling and force us to recognize that we will always have more to do. So, we must roll up our sleeves and get to work. Today, we offer our full support to Dr. Bailey, the advisory committee, and all those working on America's Voices Against Apartheid project as they return to those same community halls, factory floors, and archives to further strengthen the ties that bind us. Thank you for your participation today, and thank you for your support to this important project.
Today, of course, is about celebrating partnerships as well between South Africa and the United States. Let's hear from our next speaker now, who has represented South Africa in various capacities as a young activist, as a member of cabinet, and now is representing South Africa's interests in the United States as the ambassador to the US. Ambassador Mfeketo, we're so delighted you could join us today.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. The outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic has made us to meet virtually, and I hope you are all safe and well as we fight this pandemic so that we could meet in person one day. It is a great honor to be afforded this opportunity to address you in this occasion, launch of the America Voices Against Apartheid. As we launch this event, we must also take of the events that are taking place, like the protest in the movement Black Lives Matter, to remind ourselves that the struggle against apartheid, gender and racial discrimination is not yet over. The struggle against apartheid in the America was led by women and men of great courage, who were also facing their own challenges in the United States. Their voices led to a movement that led to US companies to disinvest in apartheid South Africa. Through congressional testimonies and protest in front of the very same embassy building to highlight the plight and sufferings of the majority of South Africans. South Africa, as some of you may well know, is celebrating 27 years of freedom and democracy, which came as a result of international solidarity against the scourge of apartheid rule. Particularly in the United States of America, our achievement of democracy was owed greatly to colleges, unions, and followed by private sector not to invest or to do business with South Africa, which brought the apartheid state to its knees and forced it to call for a negotiated settlement that led to the achievement of the democracy we enjoy today. As South Africa, we are looking forward to continued and increased investment and trust relation with the USA. I wish all of us well during these tough times and hope we will share history and ideas on how to move forward and how to learn from each other as South Africa and America. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Mfeketo. Certainly, your words will encourage these kinds of partnerships and the ongoing diplomacy which exists between the US and South Africa. Well, the 1984 Thanksgiving Eve sit-in at the South African Embassy in DC was a major turning point for the US anti-apartheid campaign. However, what many people may not know is that the genesis of this relationship between South Africans and Americans of conscience, the origins of the ties that bind, date back more than 100 years before this iconic night. Let's explore that relationship now. Ms. Woods, this is a subject very close to your heart. This is an area of history that you studied very, very closely. Let's discuss those early interactions between Black South Africans and African Americans. Sketch a picture for us about the provenance of those ties and who some of the major players were.
Two of the main figures from the United States of African descent who made a pathway into South Africa were Henry McNeil Turner, bishop from the AME Church, who made his way to South Africa, was one of the first, or perhaps the first minister who came to South Africa to bring his organization of church to the continent, to South Africa. He had been a chaplain with the United States Army during the Civil War. And so he also was quite familiar with Southern life, how African Americans fought for their own freedom during the Civil War, and how they were trying to make a way for themselves in liberty, in freedom. And around this time, Ethiopianism was a movement that was going on with independent churches in South Africa, where South Africans wanted to take more control of their spiritual lives, their private lives, and safe spaces for organizing, which really was secret organizing. And this gave them the opportunity to control schools as well, because with mission churches, there were mission schools. Another person that we have is Orpheus McAdoo, who made a great impact in South Africa when he brought in the 1890s, I think they did a tour in the 1890s, he brought the Jubilee Singers from Virginia. Now, Orpheus McAdoo patterned his Jubilee singers, a choir, and they sang a cappella mostly, after the Fisk Jubilee Singers. So a lot of these developments are coming not only from the churches, the schools, and the plantation, but the HBCUs in the United States. Fisk had its own set of Jubilee Singers, but Orpheus McAdoo was a classmate and a colleague of Booker T. Washington when Booker T. Washington was at Hampton Institute. They both taught there. And so with Booker T. Washington, who had been a slave, Orpheus McAdoo, whose mother had been a slave, the next generation out of slavery wanted to to be able to be at the forefront of educating the freedmen. So at Hampton Institute, the Virginia Jubilee Singers were formed. When they came to South Africa, when they toured South Africa, they were dressed in Victorian clothing, but the songs they were singing, when we say Jubilee, we mean celebration, or a celebration of particularly looking toward freedom and liberty. So when the songs they were singing were reflective of plantation life, not only just plantation life, but looking forward to freedom, looking forward to celebrating freedom and how to live as free people. And so one thing about the Jubilee Singers is they sang spirituals, what we call spirituals. And some of these this is coded language. It's the language that enslaved people use to communicate with each other without people in control of them understanding what they were saying. And so this is kind of in the same vein as the Ethiopianist movement, where the coded language and the spirituals reflect a belief or a comparison to the biblical Israelites. And so Orpheus McAdoo and Henry McNeil Turner were two important people in early South Africa as far as African Americans.
Mr. Sudakaza, if I could bring you in here about the importance of the HBCUs in the ongoing fight against discrimination, whether it was in South Africa or in the US.
You had the development at, again, HBCs, as you mentioned, but the first development was actually at a historically white institution, the development of fraternities for African Americans. And Alpha Phi Alpha, of which I'm a member and helped form a chapter here in South Africa, which was founded in 1906, had one of its earliest members, Dr. Max Jurgen, come to South Africa in 1920 with the YMCA, with Young Men's Christian Association. And he actually stayed here 12 years. And that's important because when we launched Alpha Phi Alpha's local chapter, Rho Phi Lambda, 10 years ago, we thought we were, in essence, doing something in terms of creating a linkage. As we started unpacking the role of our organization in South Africa, we stumbled across people like Dr. Max Jurgen, who had been here in 1920, people like Dr. Alfred B. Numa, who was South Africa's first Black medical doctor, who became a member of our fraternity at Marquette University in 1923, and there started creating linkages with, again, other members of our fraternity, but others in the African-American community, and bringing them to think about South Africa in a way. And this was, again, early days of the struggle. And so you had other members of ours, like W.B. Du Bois, like Paul Robeson, and Max Jurgen. They created, this was with Dr. Alfred B. Numa, an organization called the Council on African Affairs in the 1940s. And so you had this effort. And again, we think of the anti-apartheid movement as something really in the 80s, 70s, 80s. But they were advocating in different channels, United Nations, to, again, end the apartheid movement, end the rule of South Africa by minority whites. We also then, in kind of unpacking, it was our history. And the reason that we wanted to do that is we were trying to make an organization that was foreign to the South African academic structures, a fraternal organization relevant to contemporary Black South Africans. So we were saying, well, hey, we've had this linkage far longer than just the 10 years of our chapter's existence. And so we started doing this research. And so you find people like Ralph Bunche, ambassador, who played a role, again, in protesting against the apartheid movement in the 1970s. Reverend Andrew Young, who was made the US ambassador to the United Nations, regularly criticized the South African government and the Zimbabwean government because of their policies. In 1971, Congressman Ron Dellums from the state of California first began putting forth legislation for the US to get itself out of apartheid South Africa. It actually took him 14 years to get this legislation passed, but he did, and along the way supported the anti-apartheid movement, but pre that, just radicalizing, if you will, Congress to think about how the US is engaging with South Africa and how it needs to change. I think also probably our most famous member, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, during the civil rights movements, and then, again, planting the seed for the activities of the 70s, he again also spoke out against the injustices that you found in South Africa. So, injustice anywhere is an injustice and affront to human dignity. And so we tracked all of this, and we thought, this project that we're contributing to is so important because many don't know this history. And if we who are members of the organization didn't know it, we thought how many others also did not know it. We then went on to find that the first ambassador to South Africa in the new South Africa in 1994, Professor James Joseph, was a member of our organization, and the second, Ambassador Delano Lewis, who was a businessman who was appointed by our President Clinton, was also, again, active members of our organization, but playing a role on behalf of the United States in creating a bridge to South Africa, again, a bridge that started back in the 1920s. So, for us, there was a rich history. We've captured that in film. We've captured that in posters that we use. And so, again, for us, that journey to support the protest against apartheid was one, and I think it's important to note, that also included Black South Africans going to the United States and becoming members of our organization. And there are other brothers who are in the organization now who also have gone to HBCUs, gone to historically white institutions and become members. And that's rich because it also led, at least we feel, our planting of a formal charter here to kind of a next generation of African-American institutions that plant themselves here. The oldest is, I think, is the AME Church, the oldest existing. And we were the first chapter of our organization to plant itself on the African continent in the 21st century, but we were then followed by the Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority. Delta Sigma Theta is thinking about that. Kappa Alpha Psi is thinking about that. So, as the legendary John Connie talked about linkages through the arts, there are now these linkages through fraternal and sororal organizations that, again, started at the turn of the century and now in the 21st century are growing further. So, it's a rich history, and we're quite pleased to share that and proud to be a part of that.
Michael, thank you for those comments. It reminds me that we have been given credit by Ron Dellums for motivating him to file a sanctions legislation. We began our protests in October 1970. We linked up with George Howes of the American Committee on Africa. He made arrangements for us to testify before the United Nations Special Committee on Apartheid. And then sometime in February, Ken had a speaking engagement with the Black Jaguars, a community organization in Washington, D.C. With that group, Ken went to the Black Caucus. And as he approached the Black Caucus, he spoke to the secretary and she said, well, they just met, they're in a very important meeting. And this information comes to me by a professor who's doing a film on Ron Dellums and his courageous fight for apartheid for many, many years. And so this comes from Ron Dellums' own words. So Ron Dellums says that the secretary went out and spoke to Ken and said, They just began a meeting, and so they can't come out. Apparently, Ken would not leave, and I know the kind of spirit he had, he would not leave. The secretary went back in and she said, Congressman Diggs, he has very important information for you. And Ron Dellums described this event as changing his life because he was a newbie. He was 4 days into being a congressman. So Diggs said, Dellums, you go talk to him. They sent the new guy out. And Senator Conyers said, I'll go along with him. And Ron Dellums said that the information we gave him, which they did not know, about Polaroid's involvement in South Africa, the Black Caucus was critical about US corporations' role in South Africa, but they didn't know the linchpin of having Polaroid actually make the photos for the passbooks. And so Dellums says in his memoir that from that day on, he filed his legislation for 15 years until it overrode the veto of the president. And then Dellums further reports in his memoir that he was sitting on the podium at the inauguration of Nelson Mandela, and he remembered his commitment that he made to Ken that day, and he remembered how the Black workers changed his life. So that's just another impact of the Polaroid movement that not only changed the narrative around South Africa. I think early on we realized we had to do an education campaign, and that's primarily what our cause was. Boycott was the goal, but education was the means to let the American public know their role in relationships to South Africa. And I think it's important to remind people that this movement began with Black people, that Black workers were critical, that Black students were critical, and it has to do with those original links. And the one thing I remembered when people asked me why I did this, I remembered Dr. King's words as a young girl, that we are not free until everyone is free. And I think it's instructive as we meet on his birthday to know that from the Birmingham jail to when he greeted Luthuli, Chief Luthuli at the Nobel Peace Prize in the ceremony, Dr. King stood for the people of South Africa, as we have done. Thank you.
And I just want to add one thought that I think is powerful too, at least in terms of the members of Alpha Phi Alpha. All of these, what became luminaries, kind of got their orientation as college students. I think that's critical to think about. When Dr. Alfred went to the US, he was in his 20s. And you form relationships that last a lifetime. And so, I think all of these, when I think about what has happened and how the history is passed on through these fraternal and sorority organization, it is through the educational years that you get that foundation. And then you start following people differently because you know that they went through the same experience that you did. So, I definitely appreciate that additional insight. Quite powerful.
Dr. Kani, I see you nodding there, perhaps an agreement or at some point of reflection as someone who lived through this era. Can you give us a sense of what comes to mind as you listen to the reflections of our previous two speakers?
It was in 1959. I was at school and our teacher said to us, we're going to go and see a warship that had docked in Port Elizabeth, and it was an American warship. And we were told just to be very behaving and stand still and do not talk to any of the soldiers and stay away. And we stood there, and as the soldiers were moving up and down, I was amazed of a young soldier, black. As he came out of some door, the rest of the white soldiers stood in attention. Wow. I know soldiers coming into the township to shoot our fathers, our brothers. I know soldiers to be the worst person to meet at any given time. And that image stayed with me for a very long time. You mentioned, for instance, the Polaroid. My father worked at the pass office. It was there, actually, that the Polaroid picture was being used as the most safe, you cannot fraud it, and this was that would last permanently I still remember the organizations around the township trying to say, we cannot have this book, the burning of the past in the late 50s and the resistance movement and all that. And now I'm so excited because Polaroid was one of our first targets to get to disinvest in South Africa. The second one actually is the Sullivan Principle. Before I finished high school, I couldn't go to university to study law immediately. I had to get a job. And I got a job at Ford Motor Company, assembling engines. When we heard about the Sullivan Principles, we sat in and asked if they would be applicable in South Africa. And we were told point blank that this is an American problem, nothing to do with South Africa. South Africa will continue its relationship with its worker on the basis of master and servant. So it was thrown out. We raised it and nothing happened, and the plant continued. Even in 1965, when Mr. Henry Ford visited South Africa, he came to the plant. I have never seen such an arrogant tweet in the rest of my life. We cleaned the whole place. Since Sizwe is dead, we painted the whole place very clean because we thought he was going to address us, and we would tell him that the Sullivan Principles have not been implemented. We would tell him about the segregation and discrimination within the Ford plant, which was an American plant. But he came in, looked at us, and walked out. We had prepared to sing songs for him. And that is my experience that went through that time. And the whole thing about disinvestment will hurt black people more than would hurt the white people. Therefore, people were propagating, said that we don't want sanctions. I had black people who said, we don't want sanctions because they'll hurt us more. And all we said, we're in hell already. What more can it do to us? And the few of us that are employed in comparison to the millions that are unemployed, so it wouldn't work. So that just took me back at that time, and I thought, wow, just to hear it from the panelists takes me back to that time when we struggled, and trying to find the voice. And the African American especially, during the 60s in South Africa, was the only hope we had. I remember speaking at some function, and somebody said, what do you want us to do? I said, send in the Marines, you do it all the time. Whenever there's problem all over the world, you move in. Why can't the African-American soldier move into South Africa and assist us in driving them white people to the sea where they came from? That was a little bit too radical, of course. Thank you.
As we all are in our youth. Dr. Kani, that was fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing that. But I also think it's going to be very important and highlights the importance of a project such as this, reflecting stories which perhaps are undertold. And I think this is going to be a great wealth of information and wisdom for younger people to understand these nuances, these intricacies, and these synergies historically between the two countries.
When we moved into the theater and we knew that this was the only voice available now. It was after the 60s of the treason trial. It was after the Rivonia trial and the loss of hope. Everybody was in exile, dead or in prison, or we don't know where they are. Coming from the Eastern Cape, Nico, you know how the movement, that the center part or the heartbeat of the struggle was in the Eastern Cape. It was there that each day we went to two different schools, the one of Bantu education, and then later in the afternoon, we had Sispriti or Comrade Priti wipe up that nonsense and give us the right education. So even becoming an actor and a writer was to use the voice, to use the time to speak, to keep that flame going on. And all this time, we never really had the impression that we would ever go to America. It was in 1972 when we wrote Sizwe Banzi is Dead with Winston Chona and Athol Fugard, and we took it to England. And there were so many people, even the ambassador from England, from America, stationed in England, came to see the play and said, this has to go to America. And fortunately, when we arrived in 1973, at 74, it was at Connecticut at the at Yale University. And that's when I met Lloyd Richards. And many of being introduced to other political activists in the cultural sector who supported the struggle of South Africa. We found those synergies and we realized what was surprising to us coming from South Africa is that the condition of the African American was far worse than we had imagined, because we thought the problems were solved during the civil rights. We thought that they are now in a better position, but not in comparison with South Africa. We're still struggling to qualify in the definition of a human being. So therefore, our work and synergies and connections with people like James L. Jones, Sidney Poitier, people like Brock Peters, and Harry Belafonte. We found people like there who were working, Barbara Masakela, Hugh Masakela, people like Letta Mbuli and Kaipa Semenya, who had been there ahead of us, who had spoken about the cultural challenges and how we could work together into bringing a better world. Ours was always focused on, if there's any person anywhere in the world who is oppressed just simply by wanting to air and voice their rights, that became our struggle. It was then that we adopted the African American struggle, and they adopted ours. And I mean, if you go to history up to John Dube, you can go to Masisi Kunene, Eskia Mphahlele, you can go back to Professor Khositsile and Malek Mbete. The movement was much stronger. The anti-apartheid movement was much stronger when we got to America. There was sort of a comfortable one in England, which worked very well, but it was really comfortable. Only when you went to the Hyde Park to listen to speeches about what's happening in South Africa. But it was intense in America, which then gave us this hope that, wow, we're now in the situation. 1975, I win a Tony Award for Best Actor with Winston Chona. I come back home, I got arrested. Immediately detained for 23 days in solitary confinement. And this, for the reason was, it was a Tony Award and was a critic review by John Barnes. I hate him up to today. He called our plays the most heavy indictment of the ignoble South African apartheid regime. And that was, I was trying to explain to the security police interviewing me or interrogating me, that I didn't say that. That's the opinion of a journalist. It was not me. It was then that I realized that we've created something much stronger than we ever thought. And as you say, that these relationships are critical even today. Even today, in 1982, I was back from America and I came home and I got an information that I'm on the assassination list. I said, for what? Because I had been in contact with people that are marked as enemies of this government in America. And you're being questioned every day. And one night with my wife driving to see my father, they hit me, 11 stab wounds, left for dead. I survived that assassination and went back to America and continued to work. And that is why in 1995, when President Thabo Mbeki proposed that I receive the Order of Ikamanga for the contribution through the arts. So we've always had this special relationship with the biggest home of Africans in the diaspora, which is the United States. So when you look at what's going on today, I'm amazed and I want to know, where's that spirit? How do we still have these kinds of problems in the capital? The seat of democracy that is invaded and disgraced to the eyes of the world. We hurt more what was happened that day than I believe anybody else in this country who have had this incredible relationship with the American activists at every level. We are more disturbed by what's going on. And we wish we could voice our voices and spill loud to say, we support democracy, we support decency, we support or against this populism that is going in the world, that people could suddenly become a leader by lobbying, not a leader by design and a blessing and ordainment by the ancestors.
Fascinating, Dr. Kani. Professor Ramubi, let's bring you in here. What is your sense about what the impact was of those cultural interactions between Black South Africans and Americans?
I went to Howard to study for my PhD. So all my degrees from BA to master's degree, even when I was in the history department, I was never taught African history. So when I got a Ford Foundation International Fellowship, I knew that I wanted to go to Howard University. So when I got to Howard University, previous to that, I had worked for the Robben Island Museum. And that's why I wanted to interview Dekani for his play, The Island. We're talking about that, which is very, very important. So using my apartheid schooling, which said that we don't have culture, my focus using Robben Island and going to Howard University, my scholarship focus on culture. And that's what I want to talk about right now. I wrote an article titled The Ties That Bind African American Consciousness of Africa Through Culture and Sport. And I was trying, the example that Ekani used about the African American soldier in Port Elizabeth is a very, very powerful image. I want to use the same example with Mark Matabane, who saw an African American, Arthur Ashe, playing tennis in Soweto, beating white tennis players. That image in the mid-1980s, it was powerful. And Mark Matabane wrote a book titled The Kafir Boy in 1986. And he continued to have a conversation with Arthur Ashe, African-American Wimbledon champion, a black man, a powerful image. They continued to have a conversation, and he brought Mark Matabane to America, and Mark Matabane in America wrote the sequence to Kafir Boy in America. That's one part. When I worked for this project, the Howard University, Republic of South Africa research project at Howard University, my professor, Professor Joseph Harris, said to me, Neo, you're from South Africa. And she said, Mama Africa, Miriam Makeba. And Professor Harris said, Neo, Miriam Makeba, when she came to America, 1959, 1960, she is the one through her music that was able to conscientize the African American community about the struggle against apartheid. That's very, very important, and also Hugh Masekela. The support that Hugh Masekela and Miriam Makeba got from Harry Belafonte is very, very important. It continues to show the ties that binds. Okay, so it's a very, very important Africa's Voices Against Apartheid. I think it's going to help us. I'm teaching at Wits University. It's going to help us to bring it into the classroom so that the children, who said decolonize the curriculum, decolonize history, they'll be able to see. I'll ask Tatekani to come to class and talk about these issues. It makes history alive. So the point that I want to emphasize is that culture, you cannot really study without focusing on the culture. The last point I want to make is Ahmed Kathrada. When I interviewed Ahmed Kathrada before he passed, who was on Robben Island. On Robben Island, they used to order music LPs, music LPs to play in prison. And Ahmed Kathrada said to me, now I ordered Paul Robeson, and he laughed at me. And he said, you know why I ordered Paul Robeson? He said, the apartheid government didn't know that Paul Robeson was an activist. So these ties are so interlinked, and they continue today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. That was really interesting. Let's expand on something you touched on a bit earlier about Arthur Ashe having played here in South Africa. Dr. Thomas, you were and continue to be involved in activism when it comes to sport. Talk to us a little bit about why sports was such an important platform for the anti-apartheid movement.
Sports were important because it was often an international coalition coming together to say that we're going to stand against these injustices. One of the key moments was in 1964 when the Olympic Games banned South Africa from competing. And so South Africa, because they would not allow athletes to compete in the national trials together, they were banned in 1964. Then in 1968, the Olympic Games decided to allow South Africa to compete again. And that was a crucial moment because it helped intensify the international pressure, because in the aftermath of the IOC saying South Africa can re-enter, the coalition got stronger and they ultimately forced the International Olympic Committee to reverse its decision. And so South Africa did not come back into the Olympic movement until 1992. But after the Olympics banned them, then individual sports, cricket and rugby and tennis began to become a part of that. And when it comes to Arthur Ashe, the Arthur Ashe visit to play in the South African Open is really important because it highlighted a couple of tensions in terms of how people should approach apartheid. At the time, the South African Open in the early 1970s was the 6th most prestigious tennis tournament in the world. Some people thought that Ashe should participate because it was important that people in South Africa saw African Americans and saw Americans coming to see them, to check in on them, to say that we're concerned and we're listening. Others thought Ashe coming to South Africa was a hindrance because it gave legitimacy to the existing system. And I think that debate about what was the most appropriate means of addressing this issue, do we engage or do we boycott, became one of the most important debates taking place throughout the entertainment world during the 1970s.
To what extent do you think that kind of activism, as effective as it was under apartheid, has informed current protests by people like Colin Kaepernick, for example?
I think those earlier forms of activism are instructive because they give us an opportunity to think about context, what works, what doesn't work. But I also think that in some ways they provide these symbols that are easy to understand, that also reach a broad mass of people who might not understand the intricacies of something like the Sullivan Principle, but they can see somebody taking a stand. And so what it does is it takes a conversation that might be happening in certain communities and it gives it a much wider and broader audience.
Dr. Kani, for many people of my generation, we know you as a great thespian and a director of the stage and a playwright. But for many much younger people, they, of course, would associate you with that blockbuster movie, the amazing and huge success that is Black Panther. How do you see the impact and the importance of the Black Panther in continuing this narrative of the ties that bind not only between Black South Africans and the US, but broadly in the African diaspora, and what specifically the use of our language is closer meant in binding us together?
What an incredible experience, and tribute must go to the young director, Ryan Coogler, who was given a story of a comic book story about an African hero, a superhero, and decided that he would use this opportunity to highlight that relationship between the diaspora and the mother continent, and whereby he even instructed the designers and the sets and costumes to look at a representation of African diverse cultures. He wanted an image on that screen that any African anywhere, or African American or African in diaspora, would be able to say, that is me. And therefore, when we met, first before, of course, I met Chadwick Boseman when we were filming Captain America Civil War. I walked on set and I was introduced to all the principals, and suddenly he comes over and he says, Molo Baba, which means, how are you, elder? And I said, whoop, where did you get that? So now I was filming in South Africa and I heard them speak the African dialect in the Western Cape. I said, is it close? He said, yes, that's exactly. Then there was a scene after Scarlett Johansson leaves and I'm speaking to my son and I'm saying, I haven't seen you for a long time. I miss you. It's in English. Then I asked the director, why can't I say it in my language? We're both Africans. And you want us to believe that Wakanda is a country in Africa that was never colonized, but is so developed that it is a space project, that they visit other galaxies and they develop a vibranium resource that is more powerful but used positively. It could make a nuclear bomb and wipe out all these other silly countries in Europe, but they do not use it that way. They use it to assist the development of their own people. The director agreed, and then we began to teach him a few words that we could meet together. And when I arrived on the set of the Black Panther, it was an all-black cast, all African cast, with a few, and the mandate from Ryan Coogler and Boseman said they gave Spike Lee an opportunity to do Malcolm X, but they screwed him because they made him run out of money and they didn't give their hearts into it. It was almost a response to, why doesn't he get a blockbuster? A couple of years ago, when Steve McQueen won the Oscar, it was almost like a gesture. The following years, there was the non-recognition of people of color in the Oscars themselves. And yet the chair of the Oscars is an African-American woman. And all these issues were being discussed, that this was an opportunity for us to give the world that Africa is not just a dark continent. It is a continent of the beginning of culture and the origin of humanity. So now to get a director who speaks like that, and we're here, we're well paid, all of us, was incredible for us. And as we shot the movie, scene by scene, I had to give everybody a line or two, and then a little bit there and a sentence, so that we are as authentic to being African as we can. The movie opened, it became a phenomenon. It became a movement. I was invited in Burkina Faso and Ouagadougou to be there on the opening night, and Africans there, parliament, president, the mayor was talking about something done across the Atlantic, a collaboration that bridged those ancestors that are lying with mouths gape at the floor of the Atlantic. Now the sons of this side of Africa and the sons in the diaspora are working together. When I was in Accra, that was again the opening of the souls that were lost in the Atlantic. We did a ceremony with the Black Panther to open the window so there could be traffic intergoing between. And of course, we even set up the HURSAP, which Heritage and Cultural Society of Africa, which is based in Accra, which again encourage this collaboration, this working together. Imagine a little child in somewhere, Zoom, somewhere in Zimbabwe, somewhere in Nigeria, in the middle of nowhere, when the Black Panther takes the mask off, it's not Spider-Man. It's not a white person. It's me. And that became the most powerful image that Chadwick, in his last few days, gave us as a gift to the African cinema industry, not even that, to the cultural preservation of us. As Letta Mbuli said in one of her songs backed by Canon Adderley, is that sekumi kamakhulu aman eminyaka sahlukana sidibene ngenxeba yezinyanya. Says the meaning that it's been 400 years since you left me, my brother, and disappeared into the ocean. I'm meeting you now, and thank God we still look the same. We still look like each other. And those are the ties we continue. We fed, for instance, even with the movie The Roots, it also created that, it was a long time after Roots, that there was a project that spoke so strongly in the essence of being African. You're an African. If you were born in America, I'm not interested in the location of your umbilical cord because the next maternity ward was there. You remain as an inhabitant of this continent. And that for me was the most important statement. And especially this young man, after playing Jackie Robinson, after playing what you call Marshall, the first Supreme Court judge, and after also playing this Black Panther, and doing all these things in a very short space of time, being very sick, he had a clear vision of what he was doing. He truly believed that this was one opportunity to put Africa not just as the center, but as the beginning of a discourse between across the Atlantic. Now, this is strengthened more by this event that talks about that relationship in our struggles, in our movement to reestablish the dignity of the African, to reestablish the relationship of Africa and the diaspora. And I'm looking forward to our second sequel, which has been a little disrupted by the death of this young man. So we don't know where we're going to come out. But throughout Africa, the Black Panther was seen as a bridge across the Atlantic. That one more time, that an African story told by both these sides of Africa, the sides of the world, can not only be a powerful film, can also be an absolutely commercial success. No more can you tell us that African stories don't make money because they're always about their suffering and all. Here was the Black Panther that made over $1.6 billion. Now it is time for Africa. Now it is time for us to build bridges across that Atlantic, across wherever we find other Africans, and say we have to work together. I used to say the Africans are so great in advocacy, in showing how we feel about Black Lives Matter. And someone said to me, Nas, I will always say Black Lives Matter until all lives matter. I'm going to stop saying that. And that's for me the most important thing about the arts and culture. As my friend Nero says, it's the only fabric, it's the only tapestry that you cannot separate. We are who we are because we're Africans. And this is why it's important. It is important we continue these synergies. We continue this working together. We continue leading the discourse and the dialogue for a more humane and a more human society.
Professor Ramobi, I don't know if you would like to perhaps build on that, because it was you who brought us to this point about the importance of culture as a part of the ties that bind us. Looking at the Black Panther and the resonance that it had across Africa, as Dr. Kanye said, across the broader African diaspora, and particularly in the US as well, were you surprised at the impact that it had, or were people, or was the world hungry for that kind of message?
I'm so overwhelmed by what Dr. Kanye has said. Mm-hmm. I'm teaching history, and I bring the Black Panther into the classroom and say, they have said so many things about Africa, but this has not been said. Like Dr. Kanye is saying, everything that has been said is that we are fighting, we are barbaric. We have this mineral, this powerful mineral that we could wipe everybody, but it was used positively. So I want my students across the racial groups, white students, Indian students, Black students, to see, particularly the African students, to see that they come from royalty. So it's very, very, very important. We cannot continue. I mean, when they speak isiXhosa in the Black Panther, I say to them, the Constitution of South Africa says that we have 11 languages, but we continue to use English and Afrikaans in the classroom. And in my classroom, I say that we should be able, if I cannot be able to use an English word, I should be able to use my mother tongue, Setswana, so that we can expand knowledge in the classroom. So we cannot really overemphasize the role of arts and culture. I bring Miriam Makeba in the classroom. I bring Huma Sikela in the classroom. Welcome back, come back, Mandela. You know that song. It's part of history. Why are we continuing to use the white sources, the white books, you know, when we have our own people? We have John Carney here. He's just here, you know, next to Vets. He can come into the classroom and talk to us. So those are the issues as far as arts and culture that we need to bring into our classroom so that our students can see that they are part of the knowledge production, that they're part of the knowledge producers. Very, very, very important.
What role did the early Black press, now let's look at media institutions, what role did the early Black press play in this dissemination or sharing of ideas, whether in South Africa or the US?
Yes, well, as early as 1884, you have Imbo Zabansundu in South Africa, and that's John Tingle. I might mispronounce this, and so we can go back. Jabavu,
that's fine. Jabavu. John Tingle Jabavu.
John Tingle Jabavu. But that was one of the earliest newspapers in South Africa that spoke to, it gave a forum for South Africans to exchange ideas and intellectual thought. This was also one of the newspapers that shared information from America about African Americans, and Booker T. Washington was one of the people who was a subject in John Tingle Jabavu's paper quite frequently. Many of these papers also advertised not only the ideas of a Booker T. Washington or the ideas of a Du Bois, but they would advertise the historically Black colleges and universities where many of these ideas were freely discussed, or where the freedmen from slavery days and the first and second generations of African Americans were able to seek education in the United States at these HBCUs. But so the media, the different media veins, the newspapers on both sides were instrumental. One of the reasons why Marcus Garvey wanted to come to the United States in the first place was to investigate Tuskegee and to meet Booker T. Washington. Garvey had left Jamaica in the 1910s, I believe, 1910s, and traveled a bit and made his way to London and got a job with the African Times and Orient Review, which is also a newspaper that catered to the diaspora, the African diaspora in the UK and elsewhere as well. But he was I think he was a messenger boy, or messenger. He was a messenger person for this newspaper, and eventually started to work in higher positions as well. But there was a layout, an article about Tuskegee Institute, which Booker T. Washington helped to establish. It was already established, but he really was the person who developed it and secured money, secured the land in Alabama for this institution. So he understood that Garvey understood that Booker T. Washington's style of education or appeal in education was to focus on the industrial arts or industrial education as opposed to liberal arts. And so it was a way to monetize skills learned pretty much a lot from people who were slaves or people who used their hands during the slavery days, the days of slavery. So the industrial arts was something that Booker T. Washington focused on, but it was a way to monetize different skills. And so Garvey wanted to see this institution and wanted to do a report on it. He didn't get there before Washington passed in 1915, but he did make his way to Tuskegee after he had moved to New York to Harlem and had started a lecture tour across the United States. So he met with Tuskegee's second president, which was Moton. So the point in me saying all of this is through newspapers, through journals, whether they're published in South Africa, in the United States, or in London, diaspora people have had an opportunity to kind of connect and see the similarities of their own experiences and their histories, and make a way to come together and find a kinship and a solidarity to move out of our situations together. So Booker T. Washington's ideas were in South African newspapers. Du Bois' ideas were in South African newspapers. With Turner coming and establishing different branches of the AME Church. And the AME Church was also instrumental in setting up HBCUs. With the Jubilee Singers coming from HBCUs, these were paths that made way across the continent, a transnational relationship between South Africans and African Americans. One thing also to note about the media, particularly in the United States in these early days, with industrial education, many HBCUs had printing presses. I know Howard University had an industrial department. Their printing press ended up becoming Howard University Press, which published books, was a way to publish books for their scholars, for their faculty members. And so with the industrial education, media skills, journalism skills was something that also came out of HBCUs. And so it's very important that the media was another way to control an outlet for thought, action, organization, and connection on both sides of the ocean.
So while the protests at the SA embassy garnered a lot of media attention at the time and created a lot of awareness about what was happening in South Africa, that in itself did not significantly move the needle as much as this very important campaign that we're going to focus on, and that is the divestment campaign and the impact of college students putting pressure on administrators to withdraw their funds from US companies doing business in South Africa. Now, as we know from the anti-apartheid movement here and the fight against discrimination, women had often been at the forefront of those struggles, have been integral to that fight. And our next speaker is one such example. We're joined now by Caroline Hunter, who was at the forefront and was one of the founders of the Polaroid Revolutionary Workers Movement, which had a huge impact in leading that divestment drive. Ms. Hunter, thank you so much for joining us, and we really appreciate your time and your insights. Take us back to what that movement was about and what its impact was.
Yes, my story actually begins in New Orleans, segregated New Orleans in 1961, where I was a high school freshman at an all-Black Catholic school. And I had a rare lay white teacher who taught us about Cry the Beloved Country. As a student and as a child, I grew up under segregation. So we had Black everything, but we knew the kind of restrictions that we faced both legally, physically, and politically. And I rode across town on segregated buses where a Black person had to get up to give their seat to any white person who demanded it or who wanted it. So when I read Cry the Beloved Country, it resonated with my segregated life. I was moved deeply, so deeply as a student that I have the math book, my sophomore math book, where in the back, I have a quote from Cry the Beloved Country. And I used to recite it to my family and friends. I think I probably bored them a little bit with it. So we were barely involved in civil rights as students. We went to the local Dairy Queen or so and ordered food, asked to sit inside. We ordered at the colored window. And when we asked to sit inside and were denied, we'd walk away. That was my only involvement. 10 years later, after being recruited as a research chemist to the Polaroid Corporation, where I integrated the color lab professionally. I visited a coworker in the headquarters in Cambridge, Mass, up the street from where I worked. And there we saw a mock-up of an ID card made for South Africa. And when Ken Williams looked at it and said, wow, I didn't know Polaroid was in South Africa, I remembered all of the stories from Dr. Valder, Mr. Valder. I remembered the South African pain, and I responded, I know that's a bad place for Black people. So we went home and we went to the library and we looked up South Africa. And the more we read, the more we were shocked and horrified that our labor was being used to oppress our fellow Black brothers in South Africa. We read, we shared, we researched. We learned about the Population Registration and Control Act. We learned about the impact of the passbook photo that Polaroid was making on their instant cameras. And we felt that our ties as laborers here and our ties to South Africa required us to do something. So we organized a rally. And prior to that rally, we sought out in the community to find a South African. And we were treasured with meeting Chris Nteta, who was a divinity student who had just come to study at Harvard Divinity School with his young family, and who was in imminent danger of perhaps losing his education, losing his life, because South Africa brutally sent people around the world to assassinate its citizens and people who protested its brutal regime. And at that first rally, Chris spoke, Ken Williams spoke. Ken talked about our role as Black people and the role of US corporations in South Africa. And Chris spoke about having his picture taken in South Africa by a Polaroid camera. That evening, we presented 3 demands to the Polaroid Corporation. We put it on Polaroid stationery as a memo from workers to the corporation. We demanded that Polaroid withdraw immediately from South Africa, that they denounce apartheid here and in South Africa because we understood the collusion of the 2 governments, and that they turn over their profits to recognize liberation movements fighting for their freedom. So that is the beginning of my story and my historical moment with apartheid.
And there's been a lasting legacy to the impact of that kind of activism, Ms. Hunter. You have, to this day, are still speaking on college campuses about how young people can lobby and around the same principles. Tell us a bit more about that.
Yes, I've had the pleasure of years. And so unfortunately, Ken Williams and Chris Nteta are no longer with us. And sometimes I say I'm the last person standing, not really, but significantly from our Polaroid movement. So it's been my pleasure to speak to young people, both high schoolers and collegiates, to talk about their role. I was a young person when I was able to stand up against justice. And so without all of the information and technology that we have today, so I think it's critical that we inform our young people of our history, that they get to talk to primary resources like myself, people who are there, and that we also support them because they too are the leader in the future.
Dr. Thomas, if I could bring you in here as well. We've heard from Ms. Hunter about the importance of the movement that was started then, which ultimately led to growing pressure on private businesses when it came to sanctions against South Africa. Give us a sense of the importance of those kinds of campaigns, particularly as they played out along college campuses in the US.
Those campaigns were really important. There was a debate going on within the United States, particularly as people began to see that some action needed to take place. There were some who were beholden to the ideas of the Sullivan principles, which tried to create a more equitable form of discrimination within South Africa. The Sullivan principles said that there should be better working conditions, that there should be better pay. While on the other side, many of the most ardent activists on college campuses were calling for divestment, calling for corporations to remove their funds and their involvement in South Africa. And so this was a very important battleground about which way the United States would go in terms of addressing these issues.
Can you give us a sense, in your own view, how those kinds of debates have filtered through to the current struggles that we're seeing in the US?
I think one of the things that's important to remember about the anti-apartheid movement was that it helped bring together some of the alliances that had been broken in the early days of the Cold War. So as the United States and the Soviet Union began to battle for world supremacy, the ability to link the African-American struggle with some of the anti-colonial movements and anti-apartheid movement became much more difficult. And so I think the international anti-apartheid movement was essential to finding ways for people throughout the African diaspora to articulate and fight against the collective forms of oppression that they face. And I think we see that today with the Black Lives Matter movement, the same way that some of the injustice in the United States calls people around the world to rise up against police brutality and injustice. I think that linking of our struggles has been a crucial aspect of our connectedness.
Fascinating, which of course highlights once again the importance of the nature of this project, that we have to look at the past and look at the intersectionalities and the synergies of our struggles as it informs the way forward as well. We have reflected a great deal on the past. Time to look ahead now. Let's discuss present day activism in South Africa and the US, and how the ties that bind persist in the struggle for equal justice in both countries. Ms. Khoza, as a young person, having listened to these conversations, very rich stories and reflections from our panelists, how do you think what you have been listening to has informed earlier or the most recent activism, for example, Fees Must Fall and Black Lives Matter?
Ooh, Nikki, I have goosebumps. Definitely do not feel worthy of this space, and feel very privileged to be sharing a platform with people I grew up looking up to, and also just listening and taking in all these stories, and also feel a bit of pressure, asking myself, what is it that I'm doing with the space and the time and the resources that I have to liberate my people? Because Black people in South Africa, yes, we are liberated, but we don't have economic emancipation. And without that, you can never fully say you are liberated. I would say my first awareness about apartheid or white supremacy, let me share the story of how my grandparents were teachers, married for over 45 years, and they were never allowed to work in the same Bantu stand. So Umakulu was forced to go and work in another Bantu stand, Transkei, and Utamkulu was left, my grandfather, working in another Bantu stand, Ciskei, where we worked. And so we had to go and live with Umakulu, where I did my second grade in a farm called Falbank. And Umakulu was a school principal, respected by the community, and all the Black boys were forced to be up at 4 a.m, go and milk the cows for the master. And this one day, my brother came back crying, and they were beaten up, badly so, by the master. And because they had been playing around, and the cows went to eat where they were not supposed to eat. And I saw Makulu putting on her clothes, marching towards the master's house. And as we were walking behind, I remember thinking, in fact, being very scared that here's this Black woman going to charge at a white master in his own farm. And I watched Umakulu put a white racist in his place. And for me, that was another awareness that we are not we shouldn't be so scared to stand up for ourselves. And that was in the early 90s. So I grew up in a family like that, where women were in charge. Black women were leading in communities. I think it's very important when we tell our story to not necessarily just highlight the Black man. It's very easy to, because of the Rivonia trialists. They went to Robben Island, but who stayed behind and took care of the families when the men were arrested? Who stayed behind and took care of communities where these men were arrested? And you cannot even begin to speak about fighting for apartheid in South Africa, and you do not mention Umamu Nomzamo Winnie Madikizela Mandela. You have missed it totally. Umamu Winnie, when Nelson Mandela and the likes were in jail, when Odado Tambo were in exile, one woman amongst many stood and ensured that the name Nelson Mandela is not forgotten. People might have not seen his picture for some time, but they remembered the name. They remembered the name because Winnie Mandela stood and fought. She was, as we all know, locked up for 8 months without speaking to the children at some point, not knowing whether they were alive or not. So Umamu Winnie has to be central in such conversations. So for me, I'm not so young anymore, Nigiwa. So for me, as a 35-year-old, I'm turning 35 this year, Black woman, I am aware of the space that I am in, where to this day in South Africa, I still, for instance, have to pay sanitary towels at such a high price with tax. Yet I have got parliament that is packed with Black women. I have got instrumental and very high key organizations that could be leading certain conversations about my emancipation and my protection. But it's still not happening. And I know that as a Black woman, 1 in every 3 of us gets killed and raped in this country, every single minute. So when I watch the news in America, and I remember when Sandra Blunt was killed, I was in the US then, I was in DC at Howard. So for me, when we see those images of us, irrespective of where we are in the world, in South Africa, in DC, still we get brutalized. The violence against Black bodies. For me, it's sort of, one, it depresses you a bit because you wonder what is that we did for us to always be constantly fighting for our space, fighting for our voice, and fighting for our freedom. But at the same time, it gives us an opportunity to connect with our sisters across the oceans, to learn from each other and for each other, for Black women to be fully free, for Black women to be fully protected. We have to do it, unfortunately. And in South Africa, we have learned that the hard way. We have learned that because our courts at times are not treating us the way we should be. And even our own legislature at times. So we have to stand up for ourselves. So I grew up highly influenced by the American culture. I grew up in Living Color. I grew up on The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. I grew up seeing these images of Black people that I was not seeing where I was growing up in. And it enabled me to imagine a life out of the community that I was living in. Yes, we had TV sitcoms, It's Good, It's Nice, and all, but there's a particular lessons that we got from the sitcoms or TV productions from America that we were not getting from here. And I was able, as a young Black woman, to identify myself. Seeing, for instance, Oprah producing and hosting by far one of the world's most iconic TV shows was something for me. For a moment there, I thought I wanted to be like you, Nikki, and be on TV and be like Oprah and you, because that was representation for me as a young Black woman.
Very salient points that you're making, and which I think, in fact, many of the contemporary struggles that we're seeing, such as Black Lives Matter and Fees Must Fall or Roads Must Fall, brought into sharp focus the issue of intersectionality and also the role of women specifically being at the forefront. Because it isn't that women didn't play a role. As I said to Ms. Hunter earlier, women had always been at the forefront, but it always depends on who is documenting the story, who the storytellers are, that women are written out of those narratives. Ms. Woods, let's bring you into this discussion now. The lasting impact of the solidarity and the activism that we saw as part of the anti-apartheid campaign and the solidarity of American citizens. Of course, we must always be mindful that it was civil society that was at the forefront, not necessarily the authorities. What are the lessons that can be learned by these current movements that we're seeing in both our countries?
That's an excellent question, and Sister Koza brought up some really important points about women and their role in this history as well. First, I think we need to look at and never ignore the trajectory of Rosa Parks and how many different movements and areas of the country she was an activist in, how many communities she affected and led and inspired. She was at the embassy in 1984, 1985, the South African embassy. And it was when she joined the demonstrations that a lot of attention was brought to the daily protest at the South African embassy that lasted for a year. But she started her activist work back in Montgomery, not on the bus, not in the bus boycotts. That was a prominent moment for her as well. There were also women who led bus boycotts in South Africa, which is another parallel. But what Ms. Parks was doing was investigating women who had been assaulted by white men in the South in Montgomery. And so she was doing this for the NAACP. So these just, what Sister Koza has discussed, just brings around a lot of different points that need to be made. So the trajectory of a Rosa Parks, we owe a lot to her. There were also women at the forefront of the Free South Africa movement, which was developed from the protest in front of the South African embassy, who had been organized before Trans-Africa was organized or established. They were educating, as Ms. Caroline Hunter described. You have to educate the public about what is apartheid, the American public. You have to educate the grassroots. What are the parallels? What can we do as Americans to address some of these things that are happening in a country so far away from us, and what their similarities? So before the protest at the embassy were going on, there was a group of women based in Washington, D.C., under several names. They kind of evolved, their organization evolved from the South African News Collective, the Southern African Summer Project, and to the Southern African Support Project. These women were from different sectors in D.C. One was at the African Studies Department at Howard. One taught at the University of the District of Columbia. One worked downtown for the city council. One worked as a lobbyist. So they had different networks. But they came to, and then one was a journalist for WHUR, WHUT, and other media outlets. But they had come together as a result of the 6th Pan-African Congress held in Tanzania in Dar es Salaam. And they were there to try to listen to the liberation movements from the southern part of the African continent. This was the last vestiges of colonialism. And so there were leaders there that spoke and that they listened to and that they consulted with. And they asked, well, what can we do as Americans? And these leaders, and I'm talking about people who had become Kenyatta, not Kenyatta, but the president of Tanzania at the time, the president of Zambia, where the liberation movements had spread out from South Africa. They asked, well, what can we do as Americans to aid the movement against apartheid? And they told them to do something about your government. And to them, that meant, well, we are the people, we are the government. So the first thing we have to do is educate people about what South Africa is going through, what apartheid is, and how the frontline states or the states around the countries around South Africa are affecting the situation. Not only that, how the government is, United States government is complicit, and how corporations feed into the apartheid machine. So it's women are, we have to focus on telling women's stories, and not necessarily the people who were the leaders or who have been constantly recognized, but we have to lift up people who have not been recognized. As far as today, how do we get the youth who are active in these movements today? And that this is a continuation of what we've been doing all along and what has happened all along. One way is to continue education, and this program, it will help to do that. Brother Neil talked about his classroom and having Brother Connie in his classroom and having some of the people in his community come to his classroom. We also must have students visit libraries. We also must build archives. We also must preserve our history in different ways, so that the youth can have resources to go to of, a Caroline Hunter. Well, what was your experience fighting against this area of oppression, a corporate, the corporate side of things, how economic oppression. So we have to put these examples of people forward and continue to have platforms of our own, like the media companies, the newspapers, the MVOs, the Bantu Worlds, the Crises. The Black media is important, and our own organizations are important. And we have to continue to contribute to them in these ways so that we can direct our youth to understand what has taken place before they have joined in the movement themselves.
Absolutely. Ms. Hunter, I think we're going to leave you the last word on this point about your parting shots, your wisdom, and the takeaway and the key lessons for young activists today.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to certainly thank Sister Koza for her words and that history, and I appreciate you raising up Winnie Mandela. During our campaign, we went from the Polaroid Revolutionary Workers Movement. I then went on with a group of women who organized International Women's Day events in the greater Boston area. And from that event, I organized a diverse group of women, Black and white women, as a collective, and we produced a pamphlet called The Lives of Black Women in South Africa, Winnie Mandela in the Lives and Struggles of Black Women in South Africa. We felt that if we can engage the women's movement in the anti-apartheid movement, we would make far greater strides. And so that pamphlet is available in a tribute to her legacy, in the legacy of many women who stood here and in South Africa on the front lines. I've also had the pleasure now of speaking at Black Lives Matter rallies to young people. And my message to them is two things: that not only is it important to stand up, that we stand with them. As elders, we have to respect their perspective and stand beside them. The second message is that it's a fight that has to happen everywhere. I think when we talk about the success of the anti-apartheid movement, it's because we addressed the churches for divestment, the universities for divestment, the legislation for policy, the arts community for cultural support and spreading the message, because all of the segments of society have been permeated by oppression, and we have to fight it everywhere it is. And so I'm grateful for the America's Voices Against Apartheid, raising this platform, providing a chance for our youth to hear and see some of the history that is still being created. And so our message to the youth is that we are all one, we're in this struggle together, and arm in arm, we will make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our esteemed panel for sharing those really thought-provoking reflections on the ties that bind, connecting us all the way back from the 1880s to the present moment and the current struggles that we face in both countries, and the continuing solidarity and the lessons to be learned. It certainly has been enriching and illuminating for me, and I'm certain all of us have learned a great deal. Thank you once again for joining us.
For Black Americans, apartheid was not an abstraction. Our own experience in America triggering within us a strong, automatic, and visceral reaction to apartheid. Thousands of Black Americans became energized, committed participants in the Free South Africa movement. It was a transcendent illustration of Pan-Africanism at its best. I must stress, however, that thousands of non-Blacks of all ages and classes became energized, committed participants in the Free South Africa movement as well. We marched every day, regardless of weather or any other circumstance, for more than a year. There were many Black Americans who were key to the success of the Free South Africa movement. And of course, I can never begin to list them all. Most importantly, the thousands of African Americans whose photos never appeared in the media, whose comments were never sought by the press, but who took time off from work and school, who made arrangements for someone else to care for the children so they could join us to help to bring an end to apartheid. To them, we will be forever grateful.
It is with the shadows of night, when the sun comes and goes, the moon comes and goes,
that we ask in weary voices which fall into the depth of the gulf, how does it feel to be you?
Watching and waiting to feel the heavy weight of every minute, come followed by another.
And nothing, even everything written in blood, says nothing about how we could wake up tomorrow and build a day.
2. Your eyelids shut, if they ever do, and the memories of those you knew flood behind the darkness of closed eyelids.
Spiraling into patterns of pain, and you alone know that once there were hopes, that once the footsteps of the people sounded on the horizon.
And now, silence strides across the sky, where the sun sweats, proclaiming a wish to rest.
3.
Can we tell you, you the children of a long hour, a long day, a long night, that hope never befriends fools?
Yes, time, in absolute eloquence, can erase our faces. Remember Sharpeville?
In those days, violence and disaster were articulate. And now, today, you watch and wait.
4.
One day, hope begins to walk again. It whispers about twisted corpses that we saw.
Sprawled across the streets on this knowledgeable earth, the tears, the blood, the memory, and the knowledge which was born.
By every heavy minute that we carried across a wilderness where there were no paths.
Where screams echoed as if never to stop. It is when there is no hope that hope begins to walk again.
Yet, like we said, hope never befriends fools.
5.
Since we have eyes to see, ears and fingers to touch.
Only if we know how can we harness time. Can you hear the footsteps?